Welcome to the Renaissance Sermon. I am your host and your mystic, Sleepy. If you're new to this, we're going to actually kick this off with a bit of a prayer, meditation, if you will. I want everyone here to close their eyes, right? And we're going to breathe, right? And we're going to breathe in through the nose, out through the mouth, okay? Now, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Good. Okay. We're going to do this 2 more times. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Good. You're doing great. This is 1 more time. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Let all that anxiety just leave. Okay? This next part, I want you to picture whatever God, deity, in your mind, and you go ahead. You can also picture your own demons. If we don't judge here. I want you to picture this entity, and this next part you might have to open your eyes for, but I want you to picture this entity, and I want you to imagine just how much this entity is worth to you. Okay. Now what I want you to do is, I want you to reach into your pocketbook, your purse, your pocket. I want you to pull out your wallet. And what I want you to do is, I want you to go to the coffee link in the description, and whatever this entity that you pictured is worth to you, I want you to go to that link, and I want you to show me personally by donating whatever that money is, whatever that amount is. I want you to donate it to the coffee link in the description. Now that we've gotten our meditation and prayer out the way, I think we usually second up, we'll try to talk about really the astrology of really note in terms of the the recent and upcoming, in terms of the big things, the big events happening in the sky. And like I said in the first chapter, all this is really zoomed into really this week, right? So we got, but in terms of actually zooming out, the weather right now is absolutely insane, and you can totally look into that if you're kind of trying to understand more about what's going on right now. And there's a concept where in astrology where the idea is the astrology mirrors the actual life, or the 3D, and it's hard to argue with that in terms of right now with what's going on versus what we're seeing today. But all right, in terms of the 3 things, if you guys really just want to look into what's happening right now zoomed in, we have the sun moving into the sign of Cancer, and happy birthday to all my Cancers out there. Also, the sun is joining with Jupiter, right? Which Jupiter has also recently went into Cancer, and you can look up sun conjunct Jupiter if you want to look up some videos with an explanation of what that is. I don't spend too much time on that, but the idea here is plenty to look into. Also, the last one is the idea of Mars moving into Virgo. Now, our first report is on the Pentagon papers, right? And I think this idea is it's something I think a lot of us may have heard about in terms of just briefly kind of understood, right? And I think a lot of us kind of like our eyes glazed over a bit because the idea was like rich people hide their money, right? And the idea is, yeah, we know already, Sleepy. What are we talking about? And this idea here, we need to really dig in for the simple fact of really understanding or just really gaining some more understanding here, because I think it's definitely interesting and noteworthy in itself. But the idea of us really moving into any type of renaissance. I think the understanding that we gain from these events is telling of really the pattern when we really dig in. And so, for those that don't know, the Pandora or the did I call it the Pentagon Papers? I meant the Pandora Papers. I'm sorry, but the idea of the Pandora Papers is really a result of millions of leaked documents, right? And this is really noted as really the biggest really collaboration in terms of journalism partnership across like different nations and things of that nature, right? And the papers really came from leaks from 14 different offshore services or service firms. And these firms basically just specialize in how to hide money, right? And thankful for us, rich people go to the same people. They go to a lot of the same firms to hide money, regardless of where they're from. And this idea, in terms of this leak, we got world leaders, and of course, I think nobody's really surprised about that. But we also have criminals, and I'm not talking like about like your uncle or your cousin, but like con artists. So kind of like your uncle and your cousin, but just more successful, right? And the idea here is that the people here are also into things like, of course, human trafficking and murdering, right? And so these are some pretty big names. I think one guy in particular was like a mob boss or some kind of really top guy for like just the criminal organizations that got caught up in terms of this particular leak, which is something in itself. But I mean, when we talk about like world leaders, I mean, it's like almost like a prerequisite that they have to be criminals in order to be world leaders today. But in any way, the idea was, just a quote here, the secret documents expose offshore dealings of the King of Jordan, the presidents of Ukraine, Kenya, and Ecuador, the Prime Minister of Czech Republic, and we'll talk about that in a second, the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, right? And the files also detail financial activities of Russian President Vladimir Putin's unofficial Minister of Propaganda and more than 130 billionaires from Russia, the United States, Turkey, and other nations. Now, this article really talks about a lot of different things, but really what I think surprises, probably will surprise a lot of you guys, is just how prevalent the U.S. is when it comes down to a place where a lot of people can go and face loose restrictions regarding really laundering money in general, or just money laundering and really how to buy property anonymously and things of that nature, right? And this is like, according to like Reuters in 2020, we're literally next up, right after the Cayman Islands and right in front of Switzerland. And that's, I mean, when you think about people hiding money, people, if you ask U.S. versus Swiss, and you try to survey people, usually, I mean, you're probably going to hear Switzerland before the U.S., but we're actually more popular. And that is very interesting, right? Because there's even another report about just real estate and how loose we are with our really trying to figure out who owns certain properties and try to tag this property to a certain owner rather than some kind of just front company, basically. And we got some serious problems, and that's, it's pretty stark. But this idea of, other than just the U.S. just absolutely being tremendous hypocrites, because we'll point to other islands and we'll say, hey, look, you guys need to reform your stuff. It's like there is no nobody pointing at us really saying like what's going on here, or at least nobody gets platforms saying that. But it is, I mean, we're literally second on this list, which is crazy. But in terms of just other notes and points, I think the idea of our favorite prime minister of the Czech Republic made it into 2 episodes, the first 2 episodes. I am shocked. But this guy, I mean, it's crazy. This guy gets in, he's like, I don't know if you remember in the first episode, if you watched it, the idea was this guy got in under the guise of, we're going to be the business-centered solution to corruption. And it was absolute just a clown show, basically, with this guy, and basically in the courts. But essentially, this guy got caught on the papers, and particularly, I mean, I think in the first episode we talked about how his company was responsible for like polluting a river and killing almost like 100,000 fish or something like that. But in terms of this particular, what's happening in the actual papers, what's been found is that this guy purchased some $22 million chateau in the French Riviera, and it's crazy. It's crazy. Well, I probably got this in the script somewhere, but the idea is that a lot of us kind of say like, hey, rich people hide their money. There's nothing really new here, but I don't think a lot of us really understand these people, like these world leaders, we'll call them. They come from nations where people are literally struggling, and that's a tremendous like you think about $22 million here, some politician hiding that. Yeah, that's absolutely a big deal, but you're not like those politicians' constituents aren't starving. They're not like the way they live is not such a stark difference between these guys in terms of with a lot of these other countries. And that's what's so crazy, because a lot of it slides under the rug. And it's crazy. We'll get to, I know I got that in the script later, but we'll get to really just hammering on that point a little bit more. But the idea of the papers themselves, all in all, the investigators exposed 956 companies and 336 high-level politicians. And these amount to at least, now this number isn't, we can't really, or the investigators couldn't quite hammer down in terms of how much came from tax evasion, and there's a lot of basically people PR for the people who were literally in these files talking about like, hey, look, that's taxed, but my government won't release that information, basically. Or there's some kind of like, it's not a clear-cut case with a lot of these cases, but $11.3 trillion was held in offshore assets. That amount of money and fluctuation is not. There's another report we'll start talking a little bit more down the line in terms of the actual, not on this particular report, but down the line in terms of this building up problem of income inequality. And I think a tremendous thing that really came up for me was the idea of how shameless a lot of these politicians were. Because we talked about our favorite prime minister in the Czech Republic, but also this idea of people and politicians, these guys would literally have platforms where they're just like, hey, we need to fight corruption and take a stand against people who evade taxes. and they are in the papers. Their family members somehow end up in the papers, which is pretty obvious. But the idea is, or their administration, they're all in the, like, they're getting it, like, the exposing of these guys is crazy. And it's not like, it's really something to really understand just how shameless a lot of these guys are when they get up in front and they talk to people. You really got to get that through, because in particular, we definitely have a problem today in terms of that in the U.S., but really having that understanding that you're talking to an ad campaign, like with a lot of these people. What happens in reality, it will be night and day for a lot of these guys, and we have to understand that, and we have to start measuring them less by how charismatic or how they're able to present to crowds, and more about what's really going on. And this idea of really the idea of I suppose holding these guys accountable. What I really wanted, like, I really think we should applaud two countries that are mentioned in this particular article that I'm going to link. But the idea is Iceland and Pakistan, right? They had a tremendous street protest where a lot of protesters came out and eventually helped really topple a lot of corrupt leaders. And this is, I mean, we need this. We really do need this, right? Because when it came down to the idea of what's happening with, and we'll talk about this in another report, but this idea of really what's happening with this another war really brewing in the Middle East right now. Like, when Israel asked for money for what they were doing, all of our politicians stood up to support them. We have instances where people are asked, like, oh, where would you go abroad or whatever, and they go out of their way to say, oh, Israel, of course. And that idea is, I mean, the amount and the extent to where we have been co-opted is not something that we can ignore, right? This has to be addressed in the right way, because there are people who are truly anti-Semitic out there. And I will say that in this particular case, the idea of, being anti-Israeli government, or, what's happening, is seen now as anti-Semitic. And they're trying, or it's not being seen as, it's being advertised now. We're trying to broaden the definition for anti-Semitism to be anti-Israel or anti-Israeli government, or just pro-Palestinian in any way. It's a growing problem, and it doesn't need to be left to really be addressed by, like I said, truly anti-Semitic people, because there are people who are coming to the conclusion that, hey, we shouldn't be doing this, but they're coming to that conclusion through really just the wrong thinking in general, right? They're not making that distinction between Israeli people and Jewish people. And I don't mean to turn this into a talk between Israel and Jewish people in general, but the idea is that's kind of the problem right now, the biggest upfront problem in terms of what we kind of know and makes really in the news more. But there are tremendous problems with corporations trying to lobby to, I mean, essentially just find ways to sell us like just the byproduct from a lot of the stuff that they produce and put it into our food a lot of times. It's crazy. We don't have, like, that idea. What's happening in America right now, we can't simply just allow it, right? And corrupt politicians is I mean, we're like, if you went back, who is it who had to give up his peanut farm? One of the politicians had to give up his peanut farm because this is definitely a conflict of interest, and it was, I mean, it was. If you think about that versus today, where you got you got the what's it called, the Trump coin. I don't know what the actual official name is, but that idea of this guy in office doing that now versus then, and we're just kind of saying, oh, this is, well, politicians. I mean, it's like are we just like accepting that? It's crazy. And in terms of the lesson here, I think is with this whole not Pentagon, Pandora Papers. I keep saying the Pentagon Papers, and the Pentagon Papers are interesting in themselves. If you haven't looked into that, please do. But the idea of the Pandora Papers, the idea and the lesson here, I think, is really told through really understanding two things. One, the planet of Venus and the zodiac sign of Pisces, right? And this is interesting because Venus would represent this spectrum of things, right? But for the purpose of this segment, you should really understand that it also represents money, right? And Pisces also rules over the spectrum of things. And, well, I mean, no doubt in my mind we'll talk a lot about that. But the idea here is that it rules over what is hidden, right? And Venus is known to be exalted in Pisces. That's what's crazy. Like that's what that means is basically it has its really its there's a strong impulse when it comes down to the concept of Venus and Pisces. I really gotta keep it aligned here in terms of before I go off the rails and start talking more and more about it. But the idea here is money. The impulse to hide money can be tremendous, right? And the idea here is that this exaltation is it's a manifestation of an impulse that Venus and Pisces yields to, right? But we can really, really translate this, right? Or try to alchemize this into another way, right? So we don't necessarily have to deal with this particular manifestation. The idea here is that when we talk about this spectrum that really belongs to Pisces, or the spectrum that really belongs to Venus, we're talking about really tremendous. There is such a wide variety for how this manifestation can occur. Our society is structured to where we can kind of, with like this, it makes way more sense for this to really occur. Or there's we see this this occurrence more relevant in society in general. But I really want people to understand that we can also, out of this spectrum, particularly, for instance, this is an example, right? So in this spectrum of Pisces, we can also pull out the idea of inspiration, right? And in this spectrum of Venus, we can also talk about art. And if like I said, this is just one example. So if it's dumb, don't be in the comments like, Sleepy, this is stupid, shut up. All right. But the idea here is, maybe after we uncover and expose how society really makes it easy for people to hide money, we can really choose to create a society that helps incentivize people to create more inspirational Pisces art. Venus. Now, our next story is really on the caste system in India, right? And this is, I think, people have kind of heard about this, right? We brushed against this idea of, in India there's a caste system. But the idea is really worth more understanding for a few different reasons, right? And among of which is really how rich people will separate themselves from poor people. And in terms of this segment, I'm going to link the article, of course, and you guys can totally choose to dig in. And if you're trying to like impress your Indian friends or knowledge with some knowledge, or if you you know, want to seem more cultured in general, but you guys, I'm linking all these articles and all this insight and all this knowledge. I want you guys to understand something. Sleepy is the purveyor of truth, okay? I don't want you to go off and try to get educated, okay? That's not what you're here for. You're here to listen to Sleepy purvey the truth to you, okay? You're a meat bag, okay? I am the purveyor of truth. Anyway, right? So straight from the article, this guy, Sagar Chaudhry, highlights how, so I'm going to put the quotations here, Brahmins are considered really the traditional custodians of knowledge with control over schools, scriptures, and gods, right? These guys are considered the priestly class. Top of the, what is it? High quality, the high quality Indians. I guess I don't. God, that sounds so horrible. But the idea is, these guys are at the top of the caste system. And I'm going to butcher this, but Kshatriyas were traditionally the warrior class who had access to weapons, and some of the members of this caste are still in the military today. The next up, right, we got the Vashyas. And these guys have really made up the business class, and they are really the merchants, I suppose, today, right? That's what we'll kind of really recognize them as. And the idea of the last official class, or the last official caste, is the Shudras, right? And these guys were traditionally farmers and artisans, and their role was to essentially serve the top three castes. But outside of this fourfold classification, there are the Hindus, which we call which are called the Panchamas, or also known as the Untouchables. And these guys were essentially just shunned from the other castes for their untouchability. And officially, these guys were like known as, I suppose in terms of the idea of, when we talk about the quote-unquote officiality of it, they're recognized as scheduled castes today, but traditionally they were, they were literally the outcasts, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But the idea is that they simply just provided services such as laundry, shoemaking, brewing, and laboring, and et cetera. But the caste Hindus, within this fourfold system, considered them polluted, and they would perform purification rituals if they accidentally touched them. And even seeing them, they like took that as like a bad omen. And I am like, you, it's interesting because balance you gotta balance this idea in terms of really bite down on what's you wanna your initial impulse, because there is a cultural sensitivity aspect to this, which I am so trying to keep. I'm like, in terms of the idea here, it's interesting because this idea of this caste system, this outcast, right? That's the end of the quotation, by the way. But this idea of really an outcast, creating an outcast in society through means that are embedded in a spiritual form or a spiritual practice is so repulsive to me that I really have to back myself up, because this right here, this idea of a spiritual ailment to a people that were simply born, and not identifying this ailment through any other means is so misguided. I am, this idea of a sermon, or the spiritual aspect to this idea of really giving you guys this understanding. It's important that you guys understand that I have a tremendous respect for this, for this concept of spirituality, right? So you can say that I have I would call it, and this is just me talking, so I could be overinflating this idea, but this idea of a purity of respect for the representation or the ideology behind this two particular zodiac signs when it comes down to spirituality and religion, and that's Sagittarius and Pisces. When you do it really, I would say, the right way, that's beautiful, right? And there are preachers that do it the wrong way, and they get, I would say, on when it comes down to Sleepy's really bad list, that's really where how you most easily end up there, is by purveying yourself as a representation of some kind of spirituality or religion, and you use that for these type of aims. I think that is, like I said, repulsive, and I I feel like I'm going a bit off the rails here, because I kind of I get worked up when I hear about things like that. But the idea here is that these guys, there's a very serious thing that needs to be addressed in a lot of these religions, right? And I think in America we have an understanding with Christianity, but also you would be surprised about things like Buddhism, Hinduism, of course, I mean, Christians love pointing out Islam, but Islam does have real, like, they all have certain issues, I would say. And getting those into real alignment is, I would say, or getting those repaired is going to be instrumental, I would say, in terms of bringing these practices into the future. And I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna get off my high horse for a second. But when it comes down to understanding this caste system, and it's central, right? We have this understanding of, what we interact with when we talk about an Indian, right? Like, oh, the clothing, traditional clothing, the way they, the foods that they eat, or something like that. when it comes down to understanding the experience of a person and the experience of really just people in India altogether and the actual system, it's central to understand this social dynamic, because we'll talk about this a little later, because Britain, when it came down to the British came in and they said, hey, look, they smacked down this, quote unquote official law guide or whatever, and there's some things, there's certain things about it that kind of hold true, but there is still a very strong experience outside of that we completely miss the mark in terms of understanding the experience if we simply look at this idea of what's official and what's in the Constitution. And let's go over just a few things. One, this idea of Brahmins, right? It highlights something that I believe we really completely miss out on in terms of our society, right? Because these guys are known as the top class, right? The top of the line, and they hold control over schools and education, right? Now, in our society, we do not pay teachers, right? We have a I mean, it's I don't even know if it's a living wage nowadays, but I think there's some bubbles that we actually do pay teachers pretty well in. But that idea of, in general, right, the general understanding, we don't pay teachers well. And this idea is I think rooted in an understanding, because this particular society understands is that our compulsory education, or particularly grades K through 12 for us, would be really more accurately defined as more so the creation of a standard citizen, right? And if you consider really just our results, right, if we look around and we ask people, the idea is that we have clearly failed, and I can go on for probably days about how much we need to do here. But the idea here is that these people are set to be extremely they're the top of, in terms of this caste system, and they're holding this idea of education, and there's tremendous I see a tremendous conflict of interest when you want to create a standardized citizen, and you're also treating this idea of a caste system as something that is religious and comes from God or something. There's probably that can be a tremendous issue, of course, but we need to understand something. These guys, they are instrumental to the society. They've embedded themselves into the society, and I think that is more. Of course, this idea of priest and priesthood, I think, is really going to be useful in that, but I think more so in terms of the power and the influence, it comes from the idea of holding this position in education. Yeah, and I got a bit in the script, but it is not. It's not time. I'm still I'm still trying to come down off of the high horse that I was on when I started talking about the caste system. But anyway, the next caste system was the warrior class, or the, God, I butchered this. I'm gonna keep trying to say it, I guess. Kshatriyas, right? And this is, God, if y'all say anything in the comments, but the idea was that this was the warrior class and they had access to weapons, right? And we need to understand that this real like this in this society, we have like this debate around like guns and gun ownership, right? And I think it needs to be really more accurately defined, because when we say things like, or when the left or the progressives, they say things like take away the guns, or take away all the guns, that is in no way the argument. That's not like that. That's not an accurate statement or accurate request, right? The what how that really can be understood is take away all of our guns as citizens, and that the government should be the only ones with guns. And I am if you're able to, like, the people who say take away all the guns can say that, I mean, hey, if you really come to the conclusion that our government is completely fine and there's nothing to see here, by all means, you make your argument and rally your support. In terms of me, I would say that I am pro-gun ownership, right? I think we should definitely have guidelines around gun ownership, but the idea of just forbidding guns is, I mean, not only is it just inaccurate in terms of the idea that the government's definitely still gonna have guns, but the idea is that it's just a mistake right now. I think, especially right now, right before the actual repair of society takes place, because like we'll talk about this a little later, but this wealth and income inequality has some very troubling hints in terms of what it could lead to, right? Now, in terms of this idea, right, this debate, I think really we should understand that the Koch brothers, right, these were essentially just rich oil people in America, and they were just getting all types of like just regulations smacked on them for doing just, I mean, there's a situation where they actually, like, there's a pipeline that blew up and killed some kid that was driving. It was like it was pretty serious. They had like all types of complaints where their workers were like, yeah, they just told me to sweep that that dust outside. And it was something like tremendously bad for the environment that they were working with, and they had no PPE or protective what is it called, protective suits on or anything like that. But and basically just a lot of people ended up poisoned or whatever. But they were facing all this backlash, and they had this brilliant strategy, right? And they called this, I mean, this is just one part of the strategy, but the whole strategy, I think they called it the Coked Octopus, right? These guys were literally like, if you talk about like a movie villain, like a movie scene for like just the villains come together in one room, that was the movie. That was the movie. These guys talking or trying to really plot out how to get the public to defend the oil companies. That was like they were central to that. But the idea was they had this really, I mean, it was just a really brilliant strategy, right? Because the idea was they coupled the oil and gas companies and the poisoning of the environment with the idea of government overreach, right? And the result was the result that they were looking for, and they ultimately succeeded in, was selling themselves to just the Republican base in general, right? They got the gun owners in the fight, and I mean, they sold even a few trucks at the same time, and that was just brilliant. And I mean, I would, like, yeah, you need to, like, you absolutely need to rein in these oil companies, but I'm also pro gun ownership. How does that make sense? Like that idea that those two those two exist in the same, I suppose, in the same category, and, maybe they shouldn't be separated, is insane. But we live by that now. And and that's just a kind of a side note and a tangent a little bit. But the idea of warrior class being second up, we should understand the idea of what that does to us in terms of our ranking in society when we lose the opportunity to even responsibly own weapons. Now, the third up, we got this idea of Vaishyas. This idea of the Vaishyas is the merchant class, and the idea is that, I think it's pretty self-explanatory in terms of the merchant class, but I think some of us may have when we try to really lay this out, we'll understand that, like, oh, these guys are behind the warrior class for some reason, and that idea might make, at least to me, right? So I'm obviously not Indian, but the idea is that these guys, they might, like, the idea of having a warrior class in between the merchant class and the priest class kind of makes sense when you think about, okay, who is the ultimate guy that can get people in line, and who may need to be, taught to get in line, right? Like everybody's, when it comes down to things like taxes and things like that are ultimately probably gonna, like, benefit the priest class. Yeah, you want the warrior class to be right above everybody else, like, yeah, you guys are kind of a part of the club a little bit, but everybody else. But it is interesting, I think, to note that. But in terms of, I don't think there's really, the merchant class is the merchant class. I feel like, hey, we sell stuff. But the next class is the Shudras, or the farmers and the artisans, right? And I think this is interesting because they really, they're defined as really serving the other three classes, right? And I obviously have my issues with this particular system in terms of how things are, but the farmers and the craftspeople, I would say they seem to be really the producers when it comes down to value, right? And the merchants, they seem to be just the middleman, right? And I'm thinking about really today's society, where things are going, and I'm kind of very much questionable about the idea of a middleman that doesn't, because I think we do have a culture of middlemen that really provide no value to society, no value to anybody, but they're there and they're able to profit. And I think that's a problem in general. But it does seem like we're getting to a point to where we may be able to simply eliminate the middleman in a lot of cases. And I think when we talk about really the people that where a lot goes wrong, I think we'll be surprised when we start looking at this concept more and more. And this is, these are the 4 official classes, right? But this idea of the quote-unquote untouchables, right? This is a crazy concept when you read this article, because it's just like, these are people who are really defined as outcasts. And there's a really, I would say a tremendous effort to really not even consider them in the census and the, counting the population, because, and I think that's really due to the fact that, or the idea of, these guys make up a considerable amount of the population. And one census found that they make up 52% of the population, right? And this is crazy because, I mean, you're talking about trying to outcast half of your population. And, I mean, it is insanity when you really think about it, right? But this idea of them being in society, they're underestimated in education, and they're overrepresented in really jobs that involve like sanitation, right? So the idea is like sewers and things of that nature, cleaning sewers and stuff like that, and septic tanks and stuff. The British, like the Constitution, like they actually write to where, or they wrote to where there's a protection involved in terms of really trying to make sure that these guys get equal treatment in terms of the actual laws in place, right? And this right here, this is really the difference, right? The stark difference between what's on paper, quote unquote official, and then the actual reality, right? What is the lived experience? Because these guys, a lot of these institutions, there's no real oversight on a lot of these cases, right? The idea is the government is not upfront about, like, they don't have to release a lot of data unless they're really pressed to do that, and they don't, and they're reluctant to do that when they even when they are pressed. This is the power of social systems, right? You got people like journalists who are, I mean, they, and I think this problem, I think, is definitely mirrored in our society, where a lot of these journalists are more like they're just they belong, in terms of this particular situation, they belong to the, they can belong to one of these upper tier class systems or whatever, but they, and they try to protect their own, right? So you don't hear about a lot of what goes on with the, themes around, for instance, like some kind of, like, if they choose to, like, group discriminate or just riot and destroy neighborhoods and stuff like that, they'll talk about the caste system of the victim, but they won't talk about the caste system of the upper class, right? That's, I mean, the way that works, the way the power works and that dynamic works, I would say, like, it seems like education seems to be central to a lot of this stuff. Or the opportunities surrounding education and stuff like that. This article points out a lot of different ways that, what I really, really like about this article is that it points out ways to where investigators can really probe at this, what's happening, the actuality, right? How things are actually playing out. And that's very important, because we do need to understand that the corruption, the actual way things are right now, we have to understand that there is a system, there's a selection process in the system that really does select for people who are just, I mean, a lot of the time, to put it frank, they're just morally corrupt, but a lot of times it's just where they have something, the people in power who benefit off the system existing the way it is, they will have some kind of power over them. And this guy Chowdhury, he talks about, like, all different ways to really come at this particular problem and really press the government to change and reform. And I mean, I'm like, this is interesting, because it's just like, when it comes down to like British involvement in anything, you just think like, well, you guys are kind of like just messing up everything. Like, but in this particular case, I think there is a room for nuance, right? Because I think this idea of you know, even if they are just tremendous hypocrites, I think it is understanding that the benefit of them actually saying, hey, I mean, basically, you're all darkies to us, like, stand together, you know? Like, that's a benefit. And I think that's something that's really worth understanding and just pointing out in terms of the nuance that does exist, right? And anyway, I think this concept of a standard citizen is going to really have to be explored as we talk about moving forward and fixing and repairing society in general, right? Because what we have now, right, in terms of with 2025, the end of June, I don't know how fast things could change, but the current administration, I can pretty much say that they're not going to move us toward a better standard. They're not going to move us toward a standard of citizen that becomes more educated or, and holds people accountable, right? But I will say that the idea of just gutting the education system, as inefficient and idiotic as a lot of that was, I think it does provide opportunity. And that opportunity is in how we really rebuild these systems. This next story, it is something that really hit me, I would say personally, because it's really about this. It's a YouTuber, right? And the YouTuber or the YouTube name is like Caste Jordan, right? And I ran into Cash's videos after traveling the U.S., right? So before coming to these videos, I went to New York City and I walked around. I think I only spent maybe a week there or something. But the idea was, I had a good feeling about the place. So when I seen Cash's video, my mouth I imagine like my mouth actually dropped, right? Because this guy, he was talking about the migration crisis in New York. And I remember watching his videos like an absolute idiot, wondering what went wrong in this short amount of time. This could have been like a year or something, right? I was like, geez, it really went crazy. And come to find out, nothing went wrong. This guy, Cash, or this YouTube channel, I don't know if that's his name, he produces clickbait and essentially just red meat for just Republicans who are just essentially just trying to ignore the millionaires that fund their representatives and just blame all the immigrants for everything. And that idea is I don't know what would I do know that there's probably tremendous ad revenue in just producing this type of thing, but this guy's thumbnails, the way he frames things, what he focuses on, probably how he makes sure to document at just the right time. If you get and you understand New York through this YouTube channel, you would think that this place is a hellscape, an absolute hellscape. And that right there, it is something this is interesting because it's just people live by something now. I think or people have started living by something, or content creators have started living by this idea that all attention is good attention, right? And that is that is really due to really just the social media and a lot of these tech companies just realizing like reactionary content is actually good for how long that people spend on their platform or something like that. There's even something with like Facebook where they were like intentionally feeding people, like rage baiting people basically with like through their algorithm. It was these guys are just like, if you look into any of these guys are disgusting. But the idea is like, this is essentially just, I mean, a way to monetize content for particularly like this guy Cash, right? And we'll talk about like another I guess a creator too. But this idea is like it's interesting because people I think are coming to a conclusion that there is a lot of, they're not improving from the technology, the apps, the content that they're consuming. And they're going to come to an understanding of why that is, right? And that idea of them coming to that understanding, I don't think that's really a far reach. We all understand that technology is doing us just tremendous bad in terms of, especially like millennials, right? The people who have kind of grew up a little before the age of the proliferation of cell phones, right? And now, right? So the like, and a lot of us are coming into like a more mature age to where like we're like kind of control, or we're about to start controlling more and more. And that idea of these guys, right? The people who are monetizing now, that it's not something that I don't think is going to be overlooked. And we'll talk about really this other example before we really get into hammering down on that point. But there's another, besides Cash Jordan's the YouTube channel, there's a content creator, I would call him, I guess. He goes by Adam22, right? And this guy literally has decided to call the guy Coffeezilla, who called him out. He calls Coffeezilla a grifter because Coffeezilla has decided to basically make a channel that holds these people accountable. And I mean, today that's going to become more and more important in terms of people, individuals taking that responsibility, but we'll talk about that later. But the idea is that Adam22 really, I'm going to link two things. One is about Cash Jordan, like rage baiting people. Brilliant YouTuber, or brilliant video came out. I have not checked out a lot of her stuff, but I'm sure it's really great. But there is one video that I think really explains it well, and also the idea of Coffeezilla's video on Adam22 is something that I'll also link out. And this is particularly the video where Coffeezilla addresses Adam22, calling him a grifter, which is, I mean, is wild, because I don't even think I said why. Coffeezilla called Adam22 out because Adam22 sold his fans, or sold his following, and basically a meme coin, right? So the idea was, hey, these are, this is my meme coin, you should totally buy into it, and this and that. And it's crazy that this stuff is legal. But the idea of what I think is really important in terms of why I think it's worth mentioning is because Coffee shows a clip of Adam22 where he says something that really sheds light on what I think many celebrities and influencers think when they decide to go down this route, and what the conclusion that they come to before they go down this route. And the idea is that everyone just kind of lets this slide. This nobody's really getting in trouble for this, right? And in this idea, this concept of a renaissance, we are on a cusp of really, I would say, genuine change, right? And genuine change involving repairing parts of the society that we've really just taken for granted as just simply not dysfunctional, right? We know these things are bad, right? We've really understood that there are people like Caste Jordan and Adam 22 that are choosing to monetize based on toxic patterns, and that is this particular idea of change. It's not like that we're not talking about people like RFK promising to make America healthy again and then coming into office to declare anti-Semitism like a health crisis, or pledging to find the cause of autism so Elon can stop waving to the crowds in funny ways. We're talking about change where people, the public, the general public, are holding people accountable for what they do, right? And this idea is going to happen independent of whether the sitting president administration, whether they lack morals or principles. People are going to wake up to the reality that these things aren't allowed. They're not going to be allowed. And the people who have benefit off of them, I think that they believe that they are seeing the real price tag in terms of gauging people's response, right? Coming to the understanding that, hey, everybody's just kind of letting this stuff slide. I don't think they understand that this concept of them being on record doing this stuff is not going to be something. It's not going to be something that they were able to really gauge by looking around, right? This idea is, I think, is a good example. Is this? There's a politician, or there was a politician, right? And his name was Frank Church, right? And Frank Church, he ascended in politics or whatever, but he led a committee of people to investigate, in particular things like the CIA, or organizations like the CIA and the FBI. The idea was these guys have gotten off the rails, right? And I don't, by no means, I feel like I am so skeptical of just the government in general in terms of people in the government, but there was a lot uncovered, and apparently it hasn't all been disclosed to the public in terms of what's been uncovered. But the committee found, and they embarrassed the CIA and the FBI. And it was just going off script a little bit. I just remember one moment where one guy who helped form the committee, he actually came to tears when he realized that the FBI was really harassing Martin Luther King, because he was told, he was telling his personal family members, man, the FBI wouldn't do these things. And when that came out in the committee, the guy was just he was he it really struck him that he was really misled to believe a lot of that stuff. And I think that was kind of a moment to where it's just that was a genuine understanding that a lot of these people may have in certain cases. I still hold a lot of skepticism, but that was pretty crazy to think that, that this guy was telling his personal family members that there was nothing going on and there was nothing to see. And it turned out that there was actually a lot to see. But anyway, in this particular committee, it came up to where Frank Church was asked, hey, look, these telephone companies, they were following unlawful orders, right? But it was the government. It came from the government. And the idea was, do we publish their names in the report? And Frank decided to put their names in the report, right? And that right there, that act, that was a message to all the other companies that the government, the government is not to be just listened to without any regard for the law or morality in general. They had a moment to where it was just like, hey, we did this, we betrayed our customers. Now you're going to be on this list and you're going to be exposed with everybody else. And the lesson was, these companies decided to listen, to unethical orders, to just unlawful, unjust orders, regardless of if it was coming from a government. They were going to be listed as complicit, and in the future, people are going to, and now in the future, people are going to know. And future generations, I think, are looking back now at these guys who are choosing to benefit off of things that they know are morally unjust. They know are just morally just corrupt. But they're going to listen, but they're going to have to come to a moment to where it's just like, no, you guys get on the, we're not gonna save these guys who decided to try to make money off their supporters and stuff like that, and selling meme coins and doing clickbait. They need to be on here too. This is not an accurate representation, or this is actually a literal scam. We're gonna put them on there for the record, so people know and understand what this is. And people need to understand that there's a cost, right? And the cost doesn't necessarily have to be something that is immediately observable. We have to understand that cost is going to essentially be something that really is more likely to be hidden when we talk about things around completely just violating our own moral principles. And this is this segment we'll talk a little bit. I suppose that this is going to just spill over into almost every segment in terms of this idea of the war with Iran. And apparently this particular segment we're talking about how the idea of MAGA being now somehow in a war. We need to really, really understand something, because they're splitting. They're splitting now, right? And particularly, there's a video I'm going to link now by Due Dissidents, and these guys note how there's one figure in particular who his name's Dave Smith, and he's calling for the impeachment of Trump, right? And he was MAGA, right? And the idea was, they highlight how really Dave not only knew, he was calling them out before calling Trump out, particularly in the administration, that for just essentially partaking in war. And not only did he know that, but he's really postured himself or established himself as more of a libertarian. And the idea is that libertarians got all types of principles, and some I disagree with, and there are others that I'm just like, okay, that kind of makes sense. We can see that. But the idea here is that he calls out Trump now, and this was, I think we can't really, like, we got to give him that. He had a hard line, like, it wasn't like, hey, I'm going to follow Trump completely off the cliff. But we need to understand something. When it came down to libertarians, freedom is a huge thing with these guys. So Trump approving Palantir to essentially get a centralized database, that arguably that should have been the spit in the face that made them say, oh, you are absolutely out of line. Like, that should have been it, but it wasn't. Like, that was kind of a thing, right? And it's a lot of these guys, like, they're posturing themselves as truth tellers, and like I said, I think it's good that Dave had a hard line, but a lot of these guys are just turning out to really just be like really just despicable and empathetic, honestly, when you see that it wasn't principles that they were holding on to, it was the audience that they were holding on to, because that audience really just decided to demonize, like, Epstein's best friend. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is like the audience, right? It is a cult. It is a cult now. Like, once you talk about Palantir, it was a cult at that moment. When he said the Palantir stuff, like, all that other stuff was absolutely a lot of stuff was absolutely unacceptable, but to the libertarians, that should have been it. That should have been the point to where it's just like, oh no, this is absolutely not gonna happen. I don't know why you think that this is like, or we're gonna go along with this, and there should have been absolute calls for impeachment at that point. And we'll talk more about, like, kind of just I suppose just the Palantir in general, but in general, this idea is it's disheartening, because a lot of these guys, I think, I would consider myself, I mean, maybe I am more left-leaning, but I would say I'm more independent in general, in terms of I'm not going out there and, like, advocating for any one political figure. But this is, and these guys, I would say, a lot of them were a source for information in certain times, and now it's just like, well, what is this? Well, you guys are like just like the mainstream media news now, and in some cases even worse. Now, this next segment is interesting, right? Because I started kind of researching this idea around, trying to find out, like, okay, what's happening with really just this idea of the super rich people who are just buying private islands and bunkers. And I found an article, right? But I won't be linking that article, because you can do your own research in terms of figuring that out, in terms of trying to really dig into this this particular concept around rich people building bunkers. But the reason why I'm not linking this article is because it seems like propaganda for the billionaires, honestly, and the ultra rich, because it's just like, the article talks about how, like, the billionaires and all the billionaires, they don't, they're not simply buying bunkers. Some of them are, building houses with bunkers because they can afford them, and that right there was just like, it was just very like, well, what are we talking about? Because even at some point, like the same article talks about how they were buying islands, with not necessary, and they made sure to say not necessarily bunkers, just islands that were just away from the general populace, where they were less likely to be subject to protest or wars. And I was like, wow, that's crazy, because we're talking about basically the same concept here. Like, you guys are just basically moving away from people that can hold you accountable. What a surprise. It was pretty interesting in itself. And um, and being away from the consequences that could arise from being involved in a war is also by itself a tremendous problem in terms of the people who are, I mean, when you think about the oil conglomerates who can, who are going to benefit from any type of regime change that comes from the Middle East, you probably want them in America if things go wrong. Like, you don't really want them on a private island somewhere if things go wrong. And but anyway, this idea led me to really talk about or really research more about the concept of, particularly this. I came into contact with this article, right? And this article was particularly about the revolving door between the Pentagon and private industry, because this idea is interesting, right? Because our Department of Defense, it's interesting that we call them the Department of Defense, because they're doing absolutely nothing to make us a more resilient society, right? They're focused on really padding the pockets of defense contractors, right? And the author of this particular article is Ryan Summers, right? And he writes about how really this is POGO, POGO. What is that called? Government Oversight something. And I'm pretty sure this is a reputable source. You can check it out and decide for yourself. But this idea of like POGO, or this article, it talks about this door, this ever revolving door. And just, I think a quote here is really telling from the article. Is a startling figure highlighted by the Cost of Wars project is the consolidation of contracts going to the country's top defense contractors, where 1/4 to 1/3 of all Pentagon contracts in the recent years have gone to 5 major weapons contractors: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman. Lockheed Martin is now infamous. Lockheed Martin's infamous F-35 fighter jets, which are known for their major design flaws, are estimated to cost the taxpayers a staggering $1.727 trillion over the program's lifespan. And this article, it goes over like a lot of the dangers of our current system, but we're paying to make, we're paying the same defense contractors with our overinflated military budget, where the Pentagon fails every single audit, right? And these guys, they don't have some kind of they don't have a competitive environment where they're pressured to be more effective or efficient with the money, right? This is costing us a lot. And this idea of in just basically inflating the pockets of these guys, it's not, it's indicative of a very huge problem, I think, by itself. I think a lot of us need to understand, in the, in the not Pentagon, the Pandora Papers we talked about early in a earlier segment. These guys were, faced with tremendous amounts of inflation when essentially their currency was like the political or the politicians robbed the country in a lot of these cases. And somebody could spend their entire life saving up money, and now that money is just basically, it's just basically paper now, because of how much politicians got away with. And now I think that's going to become an ever increasing issue here. But outside of just that, I think we need to understand something. Before this concept of really armies, right? Armies that belong to nations, they, or nations, or those spaces in between the lines we draw on the map, basically, right? But the idea is this idea of a military, like, it was actually more close. It was actually before this concept of the nations. We had really more private militaries, right? Private militaries that belonged to individuals and groups of people that were simply paying them. They weren't loyal to a nation. They were loyal to the amount of money that they got from certain people. And we've got this problem that's becoming a lot bigger now, and I think it's very much understated in terms of what's happening, because the politicians are all paid. What do you want? But the idea here is that a lot of people, even when we withdrew from the Middle East, most of the people on the ground were actually contractors, or a significant amount, don't quote me on that, but a significant amount of them were contractors. And in Africa, basically, it is all these countries. You're seeing just private military go insane in a lot of these countries. In South Africa, you got executive outcomes, but basically it's even in continents, even in the continent of South America, we got tremendous amounts of military running around protecting the interest of rich people, right? Rich people who have who want the the bananas that we get. Those guys are ruthless. They're absolutely ruthless in terms of how they do business with these countries, and it is insane that they're able to do this and that they are actively doing this. But this idea of private military, it's growing in popularity. It's not diminishing in popularity. It's growing, right? And companies, right now, they're coming to an understanding that, hey, we can kind of do regime change in this place, and then we have access to the mines and the people who work the mines for very, very small amounts. We got it, And if they talk, if they dare talk out their side of their mouths, then we'll handle them. We got it's a paradise. And you guys have to understand that we haven't seen this concept of what our government is abroad. We don't know how life is abroad. We don't know that. When it comes down to these people, our idea, our bubble that we live in, if it ever pops, that is not something that you can simply just put back in the genie's bottle. You can't do that. That's why it's very, very much important for us to pay attention to what's happening, especially when it comes down to rich people and this increasing wealth gap. These guys right now, like, you don't want these guys, these armies coming up who are only loyal to money, because the people who can pay for them and can afford them are the people who have been stealing our tax dollars for a very long time. You know what I'm saying? Like, these aren't, you're not going to, if it ever comes to America, you would wonder. I have like, I wrote a poem one time. It was just like, basically like, there was a person who asked like, hey, why do all the soldiers have foreign accents? Right? And you don't know that until you really understand the concept of, oh, you can afford an entire army from another country that was, essentially trained by people from our military who went into the private industry to teach other people, how to build drones or whatever. And now they're marching on our streets to tell us to get inside of our homes and make sure that we follow suit with. It can get I can't paint a bad enough picture for you if this bubble pops, because we inside the country we looked very, very much clean, but it is night and day. And I want you guys to understand that concept of Doge. These guys just went in and they got all this data, and then they go to the Pentagon and they sit down with everybody in the Pentagon and they want to talk to them, like, formally. Interesting. Elon comes out himself to talk to these guys. It's crazy. He didn't. There was no meeting that I remember with anybody else. But all of a sudden, you get like an increased military budget, which is, wow, it came out of nowhere. You guys need to understand something. The chances that the chances that this is more so a very much agreed upon liquidation is a lot higher than you guys understand now. And that the world is really, or not that you guys understand, but that's being broadcast right now. We need to really come to that understanding and that conclusion that this was an agreement for this guy to come in and do what he's doing. This was an agreement across the table. This was not something that we were just overwhelmed by this overwhelming force, like China's coming in to take over the to take over the government or something. In terms of the lesson here, right? So we have the zodiac sign of Capricorn, right? And Capricorn would represent themes around defense, right? And Mars is the planet that would represent, of course, this spectrum of things, as does Capricorn. And the idea is that it also, in this, you should understand that Mars represents war and conflict. And Mars is particularly exalted or strongest in Capricorn, right? So it kind of makes sense that a lot of the military around, it's named, the Department of Defense, right? Like, you really don't want to name an industry the Department of Attack. That would be, that would be wild. But the idea here is that we can use this energy, right? Because Mars is exalted, so that means it's strongest, and it's the strongest in Capricorn. And we can use this idea, this impulse, right? And we have this investment in the Department of Defense. I think that the turnout is horrible, but we have a solid impulse to really invest and understand that, because this is how societies form, right? From armies, right? You get the army, and the army protects this line drawn or whatever. I think that impulse may be correct in terms of how things are today, but it also, in terms of actually what we're doing, what we're seeing, another way to use this energy I think would be, for example, Capricorn also in that spectrum would represent resiliency. And I would recommend that we reform this Department of Defense into being responsible for making a more resilient society. So we can't simply just let things go the way they are now, though. That's the ultimate understanding. So our next story is revolving around this figure some of you may have heard of, and his name is J.D. Vance, right? And one of the links is going to be really a short article. It's a short article by Open Secrets, and you can probably, I mean, if you look, you can probably find a video that would really dig deeper into this guy. But I think this particular article is interesting because it really highlights this idea of this relationship. One thing in particular about this relationship, I think a lot of us may have heard that this guy is backed by Peter Thiel, and now he's also kind of thought of as an opportunist because he was very much a critic of Trump. So now him being the VP is definitely interesting. But he called Trump Hitler, and one thing that I think was particularly, like I was saying about this article, was particularly surprising was he actually met Peter Thiel as a law student at Yale. And Peter Thiel, basically, for those of you that don't know, is like the guy that looks like he just got done like sucking baby blood or something, and he's really sweaty. But the idea is that he was giving a lecture, and J.D. Vance called this particular lecture that Peter Thiel was giving one of the most significant parts of his life. And Peter Thiel actually helped Vance fund a startup after they met. And it's interesting because their bond, you hear that he's backed by Peter Thiel, it's interesting, but when you understand that idea of meeting in a law school, when you're coming up as you're kind of like developing, and you got this guy that is, essentially, it sounds like he can literally be your mentor, but this guy's like just cartoonishly evil, basically, and it can lead to some very, very shadowy things in terms of, J.D. Vance going into politics in general. And J.D. J.D. Vance, he wrote some article, and that's the Open Secret. This is through the Open Secrets. There's a link to the article. But he's like he mentions how this particular talk that Peter Thiel gave, it spoke to some psychological part of him, basically. And I must say, I love when like these weird tech freaks mix with psychology and they get in touch with their feelings, because they like, JD, I think it's pretty safe to say he is an opportunist, but like, when it comes down to people like Alex Karp, who works with Peter Thiel as well to own Palantir, they will literally say the quiet part out loud. It's crazy because it kind of reminds me of like trends where like the social media kids, they film themselves doing crimes. And when it comes down to these guys, I think it's wonderful. I really do like it. But this guy, he like this particular situation, it reminds me of the Pandora Papers, right? Because J.D. Vance, he actually comes out, and this would be just like, it would make people just squint like, what? When you really understand like the idea of his history with Peter Thiel, is like, what are you talking? Why would you even mention this, right? But he talks about this tech oligarchy being a problem, right? And he is literally best friends with the figurehead for the tech oligarchy, or not best friends, but he's funded by this guy who's like the figurehead for the tech oligarchy, which is insane to think. But when you look at it, like a lot of these guys, like I said, that and you know, in the one, I think it was the first segment, they're shameless. They are shameless. They are absolutely shameless about what they say and what they, you know, and how it conflicts with what is actual reality. Um, and I think recently, this was like where JD Vance, I think he went on maybe 2 times by now, but recently, right? So as of June 20th, 2025, JD Vance went on Theo Von's podcast where Theo asked him about Palantir, right? And I'll link a segment from Sabby Sabs, but from a YouTuber I like. But the idea is essentially JD Vance says that private companies, when he's asked about this, he says that private companies already have and share way more information than what the government has. And his argument seems to be that the government is a safer alternative, right? And a few points here. I think the government, one, can absolutely rein in big tech from collecting data. The problem is that they are funded by big tech, right? There's a book by Brian Tao called Means of Control, right? And in this book, he mentions how like one governor was like, or one representative, he was kind of the loner when he spoke up about big tech and, you know, reining in big tech and how they could do that. And he also notes out how like just how much of a wild west it is out there when it comes down to really the tech world in general, right? Because like, please just get the book, but or just like understand like parts of the book or see an interview or something if you don't have time. But the idea is the government is they will fund apps to collect data. They will create apps to collect data. They will create backdoors in apps for data. They are absolutely data hungry. To kind of name them as like, oh, they're just kind of like trying to play catch up is crazy to me. These guys are absolutely like Edward Snowden is in Russia for a reason, right? like they didn't just say, oh, well, you know what, you were right, we're gonna fix our ways, then let me just, you know, let's hold people accountable like that. No, go to Russia because we'll kill you. Like that was the understanding that Edward Snowden had before he went to Russia. And I think I may have painted it a bit dark in terms of that idea, but the idea is that they'd at least arrest him, and because he, you know, turned in like state secrets or whatever. But whatever, we'll talk about that. But the idea here is that I think it's kind of comes up a bit, but well, also first let's mention the Play Store is. I think I want you guys to understand the Play Store is a joke. Google Play Store is a joke. Data security, what they do, there is no. You would expect there to be some kind of like due diligence from them to say, okay, let's try to make sure that this place or this app is secure. That's not their prerogative, and we need to understand that. It absolutely could be, but it's not, right? And this guy, like, this guy JD Vance, he seems to want us to accept this is a kind of a new reality, right? And the idea is that government is just going to simply take part in the data collection that's going on. That's very much troublesome to begin with. Now, in terms of the lesson here, I think when we talk about astrology, I want you guys to understand this concept of Uranus, right? It's known, this is a planet, and it's known as really the disruptor and the great awakener and the fixer, and it's also known for a lot of other things, but for now let's talk about this. And it's about to enter into the sign of Gemini, right? This is a sign that represents a spectrum, of course, but in this particular spectrum, I really want you guys to focus on the fact that it rolls over phones, computers, and data. And it will take around 7 years to really transit the sign, but I'm expecting things to happen a lot, like, pretty quickly in terms of what happens here, because you guys should understand that it's this transition that's taken place, that's likely, I would say that I'm going to say likely to take place, is going to be something to where these guys who are very much saying, hey, this toxic way of life that we're living now, it's just kind of the way it has to be. This is where they get a lot of shakeups, especially in this world of tech and data. We need to understand something. It's not necessarily that people are going to, wake up and say, oh my God, Uranus is in, Gemini, we should do this, this, and that. It's going to be, you guys tried to take this in, because that's not the only manifestation. You guys tried the understanding that I think is going to happen is kind of very much with this idea of, like, we're supposed to just accept the fact that Palantir is going to do a central database, which is insane, but they're going to keep trying to push boundaries. And the idea here is that people are going to come to a conclusion like, oh, you guys want to keep doing this stupid shit, and they're going to say, no, we're not going to do this. There's actually going to be another way that we're going to do this. And these guys who are just, essentially just stooges, right? Like JD Vance, he's an opportunist. Like, I'm just going to go ahead and call it. But they're not going to see that coming. People have, this is well documented. People understand that this idea of how we use technology and the apps we use is very predatory, and they need to be reined in. JD Vance has an understanding that, this is just kind of the new way of life, and I definitely disagree. And this idea, this concept that I'm really working on, kind of designing this concept for the Foundry mixed use development, not Palantir's Foundry, Jesus Christ. But the idea is the Foundry is being really being designed to really address this idea and this ailment of how humans act with technology. And it's supposed to, it's designed to make it easy, particularly to live and exist and take part in society without a smartphone, right? And there's so much here. I think recently I've started looking into particularly things like mesh networks, which are basically just really just local internets, and how we can kind of maybe use that concept of mesh networks. But there's this idea of providing space and opportunity for us to repair our relationship with technology is very much needed and very much sought after. And I think people, there's a tremendous market for that, if you want to use business terms. In terms of the Foundry, I think there's kind of an adaptation building to where maybe there can be an opportunity to really provide a service, right? So for a service in terms of really in the form of a contract, to where representatives would sign and really agree to really this idea of a kind of a foundry themed renovation, right? And the idea is that the city is agreeing to update its infrastructure and provide, in this case, we'll talk about mesh networks, for instance, and that would allow the people just, we'll call it open source connection amongst each other. And that right there is one idea that I've been kind of floating with. And this idea of, in terms of making the Foundry a reality, I'm going to start posting about kind of, particularly like the Foundry, I suppose, is going to be a segment in the Substack called the Foundry Research and Development. And I invite all you guys to check that out if you get the chance. And we want this particular idea of a contract when people come into the contract, or when people sign the contract in general, for people to understand when the foundry is being built that municipality has agreed that the power belongs to the many, not the few, not the people who can pay politicians. They will have to be accountable to the people. There's a lot of different ways to do this, and there's a lot of different systems involved in terms of the idea of really embedding this into the infrastructure and the networks surrounding whatever kind of renovation that takes place. But that's the overarching goal. Now, our next story is really involving really this woman, Mara Brewer, right? And Mara Brewer decided to make really an art piece, and this art piece in general is around the concept of laundering money, right? So she's made this art piece, and it's really about really showcasing the idea of laundering money, and she's teaching people. Apparently, I haven't seen that in the actual article, but I'm going to link it. I believe that this is important for a variety of reasons. One, because like just the power of art is completely underestimated in our society, but I think this is one of the many uses that we can really use art for, because in presenting a concept like, for instance, money laundering, it can expand the impact when it comes down to informing people about what's going on. And a good analogy, I think we all might have a friend where everyone tells them their problem, but they always do the same thing, right? And this friend goes along living just this stupid life until like a beacon from the heavens, they come across like a YouTube channel or some guy in the subway or something, and this YouTube channel or this person in the subway, they tell them the exact same thing that you've been saying. But the difference is that you're like the actual, you and whatever other source of information, the person, they were receptive to the same message, and even if it was from a different source, they were receptive, and they changed their behavior after that. And I believe that we can harness this concept of art in ways to teach people that same concept, right? So that different source for that one person is kind of the same thing when you think about art giving that different source of information, right? So it's the same information, right? Like, we got all kinds of books that highlight how corruption works, but for some reason we got like people believing like politicians like JD Vance when they open their mouths. You know what I'm saying? Like this is we can start to kind of see that just because it's out there, just because the information is available, we're not getting it. We're not giving it to people. We're not changing people with that information. And I am particularly excited about particularly themes around like games that educate, and I suppose with this idea of particularly the Foundry mixed use development, I'm really interested in things like vote night, or just regular events where artists like they have to translate information to their community. And this is going to be from themes around politics, translating what's happening with the laws being passed and stuff like that. So just various presentations that are going to happen in terms of, or that are really just presentations for things that groups of people want to happen in their particular city. And we're going to I think we need to really commend Mara Brewer for being really one of the pioneers in this. And I think we should all study more about what could be done with art, right? So art therapy is one thing, but a lot of different things in general. But and the same Substack, the same Substack I mentioned in the last segment, where we talk, I kind of started to use this in a way to where I want to use kind of a fictional story to relay important information about the news and such. So also check that out as well. I'm not sure exactly what the segment is going to be called yet, but it's coming up. Now, this last segment is involving research being done in Singapore, and the idea here is that they have apparently, scientists have laid out this method of essentially just getting power from raindrops. And I'm going to link to the article, but if I understand this correctly, the idea is that a special filter really made to get, to essentially for rain to collect through, it is going to be made in such a way to where those bits of raindrops can translate into energy. It can be very interesting and a very at the very least it's nice to see these things start to get thought about, right? Because even if we this is important, because muscle, we may not always see the muscles develop that that benefit us in the future, right? But that's important because in the future, this particular concept, this brain power that's being expended here, could help us in tremendous ways. So I'm always liking this, even if it doesn't end up panning out exactly how it does, exactly how we expect it to, and how it's being presented to us as. But water, energy, things like that, we're living in a time period where I believe these things, the way we use them, is really only going to be, especially in America, is only going to be appreciated in retrospect, because it feels like kind of like a golden age. The picture, I want you guys to picture a politician having to tell you guys hey, the water is kind of running low. That idea of the politician coming out and having to say that's when it's way too late. That's when that happens. It does not happen before that. It happens after there has been a problem, and after there is absolute the poor communities are absolutely getting poisoned at that point. There's not that's what it is. And we really got to understand that in terms of facing a crisis and expecting the representatives that we got now telling us and swallowing the bullet. I wouldn't expect it. And that right there is going to conclude the reports and the sermon in general. And I've already finessed you into giving me your donations. So to close out, I want to ask that you ponder this particular idea. And that is, do we need to be the primary currency? And this is an idea that really came from understanding that England and the UK, they were once at the top, but they're not anymore, right? But they are doing okay. They're not the reserve currency, but they are doing okay. Our reign at the top seemed to be linked to, military superiority for sure, but also things like the illusion that we were always the good guys, which I think is arguably more important than the military superiority, because the people in the military are the ones who, act, and they act out of a duty, they act out of a pride. When we lose that, we don't have nearly the military that we think we or that we've invested to have. But we lost this illusion, right? And that right there is important, because we need to understand and really contemplate, how can we repair our society to remain relevant in a world that's really not going to accept the idea of forcing freedom down everyone else's throat.